Oh gosh. Gosh, I'm like in charge and stuff. So I
Yeah.
have to do this stuff. Goodness. Hi, everyone. Y'all just talked to me, but this is Jared Anderson. He is the coach at Sac State and is a generally impressive person and wrote the topic paper. And now has agreed to do this lecture because I don't know, I'm not sure why he agreed to do this for me, but he's doing it and we're all very excited and thankful.
All right. Well, thank you. I don't know how excited we all are about the topic lecture, but I'm excited about the topic. So I am the head coach at Sacramento State, and I co-wrote the topic paper with one of my assistant coaches, Justin Perkins. So I want to make sure he gets his credit as well, because with a lot of assistants, he cut most of the cards that are in that paper and did a lot of that work. So we're very proud of the topic paper, and I think the first thing I want to recommend in terms of preparing for this year's debate topic is to, and I think you should do this every year, start by reading the topic paper. It's only about 30 pages long, but I think your next step after reading the topic paper, one thing you'll notice is that the topic is that the resolution we ended up with is pretty much in line with what we proposed in the topic paper. So you should also be able to find that a lot of the cards that we cut, a lot of the articles that we linked at the end are going to be relevant and useful reading for you in terms of a starting point. As we get going for this lecture, I want to encourage people to please ask me questions. It is certainly not my intent to just speak at you for an hour straight. So please ask questions and I can help to answer those questions as best I can as we go along. And if some folks like Noel and Bowers can monitor the chat or just keep an eye out if I'm missing anybody with questions, that would certainly be appreciated. And the other thing that I would like to say before I really get going, I do have a PowerPoint for you that we'll be working our way through, is that this is my interpretation of the topic. Yes, I was one of the co-authors of the topic paper, but from this point on, the topic is yours. You all get to debate it. You all get to interpret it. You're going to have different judges who you can persuade different things. So really the topic is yours. What I'm going to present to you is my interpretation, my understanding, to hopefully help you get started on your research. I tend to speak bluntly sometimes when I'm having these discussions just to try to get my point across, but that doesn't mean that you can, that there won't be disagreement, different interpretations, things that I think are so may not be so, and I can be convinced about them later on, or it doesn't matter if I'm convinced. I like to think of this more as a discussion rather than a lecture. So as you're listening, as we're working our way through these things, if there's stuff that I'm saying that is confusing or whatever, please feel free to let's engage in discussion, but sometimes we'll just need to kind of move forward because we can't debate the whole season right here tonight. You'll have lots and lots of opportunities throughout the year to make your arguments with further research. So that is my goal, is to get you all sort of off the ground, thinking about some things about the topic. So I'm going to do a screen share here to try to get my PowerPoint up on the screen, and then we'll start working our way through this. All right. Okay. Back to the top. So here we go. So our debate topic for the 2023-2024 season. Let's get it up here. It's going to probably move a little bit slowly in Zoom. Just want to make sure I didn't miss anything here. Okay. So some background. Let's begin with background. The debate topic about nuclear weapons policy started with the idea that there was very recently a nuclear posture review that was done by the Biden administration. This posture review was completed in 2022, and the declassified version of that review that you all can read, that's out there, that exists, was released kind of in late 2022. And one of the interesting things about this posture review is that while it was a move and a change away from the 2018 posture review by Trump, which was predictably very different than previous posture reviews, kind of just moved back towards the direction where the Obama posture review had been, which is actually when this topic was last debated by the CETA NDT folks, was right around 2010. I believe that we were debating this topic, and then the posture review was released, which made a bit of a mess of our debate topic. A nuclear posture review is a comprehensive review of U.S. nuclear weapons, forces, and the surrounding policy. That policy is typically referred to as our posture, our nuclear posture. Those sorts of policies have to do with things like something called declaratory policy, which is where we say when, where, in what conditions we might use nuclear weapons, against whom, those sorts of things. But the posture review also takes a look at what our weapon systems are that exist currently, how many nuclear warheads we have and maintain, what that maintenance looks like, what those forces look like. There's something called the nuclear triad, if you are unfamiliar, that deals with, so the triad, and I don't know if I have this later in my, I don't remember if I have this later in my PowerPoint here, but the triad includes intercontinental ballistic missiles. So that would be nuclear missiles that are the big giant missiles fired from underground silos somewhere in the Midwest. We've got the nuclear submarines, so sea-based is the second part of the triad, and then air-based, which is warheads that can be put on missiles that can be fired from jets and stuff like that. Those are the triad of our nuclear forces. So all of that stuff is taken into consideration. It's a comprehensive review of our nuclear weapons, forces, and the surrounding policy. So that was the basis for this topic. That becomes sort of the starting ground for the controversy of the topic, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Some more background on nuclear posture reviews. Nuclear posture reviews aren't something that are particularly old. It's not something that's been done for a very long time. The first nuclear posture review was done in 1994, and that was just ordered by the Department of Defense. So the Secretary of Defense, the DoD, did a posture review and presented it to President Clinton at the time. There is no necessarily like posture reviews are done according to a certain calendar. They're not done every year. They're not even necessarily done every administration. So the first one was done in 1994. We didn't see another one until 2002 under George W. Bush, and then again in 2010 by the Obama administration. And then we saw one in 2018 from Trump. And then we've got another one just recently from Biden in 2022. So the release of that posture review was the basis of the controversy for this topic paper, for the topic area, because there was controversy sort of on both sides of the issue. There were folks who wanted that posture review to reflect a more aggressive posture by the United States, a response to growing perceived threats from Russia, from China, and their growth of their nuclear arsenals. And then there was also controversy that it didn't go far enough the other direction, that we need to get rid of more weapons. We need to change our stance and move away from the consideration of the use of nuclear weapons. So there is a lot of writing surrounding the most recent release of the posture review, leading up to and following its release. One of the reasons why this isn't a particularly old process is that the first nuclear weapon was not even tested until 1945. So in the larger scheme of things, it's just not that old. So we first tested our nuclear weapon In 1945, the United States was the first country to test a nuclear weapon. We were also the first and only nation to use a nuclear weapon, and that was in 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Following that demonstration, following that test and use in World War II, the Soviet Union had their first successful test of a nuclear weapon in 1949, which is considered kind of the start of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. And then that started to expand. More and more nations joined having successful tests. So the nuclear club, so this is nations that we either know or believe to have nuclear weapons, include the United States, Russia, the UK, France, China, Pakistan, India, North Korea, and I put a little asterisk by Israel because they have a policy of intentional ambiguity. It is fairly well believed that Israel has nuclear weapons, but we know nothing really about how many they have, what their capability is, and they have not confirmed that they have any, nor have they ever done a test that has been observed, either above ground, below ground, anything like that. But it is fairly well believed that they do have nuclear weapons. There's another country that's not listed here, but I believe it was South Africa, did a test of nuclear weapons and then got rid of them. So they are the only country that joined the nuclear club and then left the nuclear club. Then there's something called nuclear sharing, and this is going to be, I think, an important part of the topic, which is also often referred to in the literature as the nuclear umbrella. But there are formal agreements as part of NATO, as part of our alliance in NATO, where we share our nuclear power with members of NATO. That means that we have nuclear weapons that are deployed in NATO countries, that there is the possibility that in certain scenarios, we could delegate launch authority to those nations. So that is going to be certainly something for you to perhaps research and look further into. So here's a little map I put together about basically the nuclear club. It gives you some background, some history on it. So you can see sort of down below here, the United States, 1945. I've kind of already talked through this. So, and then it shows you also where nuclear weapons were tested and what type of test that was. This map is pretty easy to find online if you're curious about looking deeper into the map, but it just sort of gives you an idea, a sense of who has nuclear weapons, where they are, what those tests look like. We haven't had a nuclear test in a very long time. There were a lot of very early initial tests, but there haven't been very many actual tests of nuclear weapons in a really long time. The way most countries now sort of maintain their nuclear weapons and make sure that any new systems or whatever is all through computer modeling, rather than actually atmospheric or underground or even these underwater tests. Okay, so this is the actual resolution that we worked on and decided and that was voted on. So there were a number of different options, but they were all somewhat similar to this. This one just seems to be like, I think probably the biggest of the topics in terms of its vocabulary, its scope. It doesn't put a lot of specific wording limits on the topic, but I think you'll find that those limits still exist based on the research. But the United States federal government should substantially reduce the number and or role of its nuclear weapons. So before I go into sort of breaking down word by word the topic here, do we have any questions about that admittedly very brief background? I'm not seeing any questions. Okay, so we'll move forward then. All right. So the United States federal government should substantially reduce the number and or role of its nuclear weapons. Let's start with our agent of action. So the agent of action is the question, right? So with a resolution of policy or a policy claim, we start with, right? A policy claim is a call for change or a call for action, right? A move away from the status quo in some way. So the first question is who? Who should do that? Who is our agent of action on this topic? As with most of our previous topics, at least that I'm aware of, the United States federal government is the specifically identified agent of action in the topic. So the call for change is the call on the United States federal government to make that change, which makes sense when we're dealing with nuclear weapons policy. They are who would make that change for us. Not a whole lot of ambiguity there. So then the question I have, and sometimes I'm going to ask you all some questions in this to try to get discussion going, is what branch of the United States federal government is primarily responsible for this policy? And I can't really see the chat here in my screen share and so if somebody's got an answer, just go ahead and unmute and tell me.
Sebastian answered executive.
Okay, yeah, and that is correct. So while, again, topic can be interpreted lots of different ways, there's always going to be some room to maneuver because the topic, the resolution just says the United States federal government. The primary branch that will be responsible for making change is going to be the executive branch. Now, what we don't want to mistake that for is that it's just solely the president's responsibility or that this would necessarily be carried out through executive order. But you've seen that the posture review is historically done by the Department of Defense. The DoD, it falls under the executive branch. The executive, the president is the commander in chief. The Secretary of Defense is a cabinet level, right, member of the executive branch. So the folks responsible for this sort of decision making in terms of the size and scope and policy regarding our nuclear weapons are there. It's a military decision. It is carried out by the executive branch, by the commander in chief, by the Department of Defense. Now, in your research, you may encounter some alternatives to this. You may see Congress has attempted, or that there are bills in the works that are still looking for, co-sponsors. They're working their way through committee that would alter things like our declaratory policy or that sort of thing, or would attempt to limit sort of the executive authority in terms of their ability to launch nuclear weapons or to expand or decrease our nuclear weapons. I don't have a confident answer to those questions other than that is unlikely. Those bills have not been successful in the past. They haven't gotten through, and there is a fairly significant question with regards to Congress's ability to limit the commander-in-chief in that way. And in terms of like what would be their ability to sort of enforce that bill, other than impeachment, right? So it becomes a really sort of interesting question. But to say, oh, instead of the president saying we should reduce our nuclear weapons, Congress should do it, it's you're unlikely to find a lot of research in that area that suggests that Congress would be the better actor or the normal actor, or even that would be constitutional. That doesn't stop people from writing those bills up. It's just that we haven't seen them passed or what that really looks like in terms of those nuclear weapons. A lot of it says like, oh, you have to kind of check with us or consult us, those sorts of things. The better question here, though, is within the executive branch, are there sub-agencies that you should know about? And I'm not going to pretend to have them all at the top of my mind. There is a list of different authorities and different agencies. But if you start at the Department of Defense for this policy and take a look at it, oddly enough and weirdly enough, there's another cabinet level agency that at least has some level of responsibility for nuclear weapons. Does anybody know what that agency is?
Is it the Department of Energy?
Yes, correct. The Department of Energy is responsible for maintaining the nuclear weapons. Now, the Department of and the Energy Secretary and the Department of Energy don't really make these sorts of decisions that we're dealing with on the topic in terms of reducing the role or reducing the number of nuclear weapons. However, they would probably be part of the implementation of the policy because the Department of Energy maintains our nuclear arsenal. Our nuclear stockpile is maintained by the Department of Energy. So things like taking nuclear weapons offline, dismantling them, decommissioning them would likely fall under their responsibility, although they are not decision makers in that area. But there's going to be several different sub-agencies that you can look at that deal with these sorts of questions. But ultimately, it would probably be a top-down decision from the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Department of Defense. Are there alternatives? So I answered this question out of order. Are there alternatives to this agent? So the possibility always exists. You can take a look at potentially using Congress, or I don't know if there would be maybe some sort of court decision. Those seem unlikely, and I would suggest that based on my scan of the research when writing this paper, probably not very fruitful ground for negatives or for affirmatives if you're trying to kind of like avoid the question of whether or not this should be the responsibility of the executive. Okay, so questions with regards to the agent of action on that? Okay. Like I said, I can't really see you all, so if you're like raising hands, I can't see that, so you just gotta go ahead and ask your questions if you have them. So the mechanism for the topic, this one's a little bit interesting. The way this resolution was written, the mechanism is just reduce. It is the mechanism for change, but what exactly does that mean? Because this also gives us the direction for our topic. But to reduce, what this means is that it's kind of a wide open mechanism. A lot of times, depending on the topic and depending on what we're doing, your mechanism is like through legislation or by removing a restriction or by adding a restriction. So restrict or whatever, but we didn't go with restriction. So we're simply talking about numerically, right? We're reducing. That is our mechanism for change. It's also the direction of the topic. So when we were first pondering writing this paper, we actually thought about including a section on you could increase, right? We could go the other direction and ask the affirmative to increase. But we're pretty confident in the sort of direction of the status quo, based on our recent NPR, but also based on circumstances like the end of the New START treaty coming around in 2026, is that we are probably increasing our nuclear stance, our nuclear posture, at least a little bit in the status quo or in the near future. And at worst, we're holding steady. So a call for an increase would have been a weird position to put the affirmative in. Something the negative could do if they wanted to, right? You could counterplan to say, not only should we not reduce our nuclear weapons, we should be getting more. That's a potential strategy. But the mechanism for change is just reduce. We feel like because this isn't typically something done congressionally, this isn't going to be a legislative, this is simply an order, right? It's an order that comes through the executive that says, hey, we're going to reduce these. The implementation of that change is stuff like, decommissioning nuclear weapons, taking them offline, removing them, that sort of like normal means. We've been reducing our nuclear arsenal. We are certainly not at the height of what we have have had in the past due to a number of different international treaties, both multilateral and bilateral treaties. We have cut our nuclear arsenal way down. We still have a large nuclear arsenal, but it has been cut way down, and there is a normal means, there is a methodology that we already have that exists for reducing that arsenal, as well as sort of for reducing the role of nuclear weapons. So it covers both. That term reduce covers both our mechanism and direction. The question about its, I think, is very, very interesting. We included the words its in the resolution. The United States federal government should substantially reduce the number and or role of its nuclear weapons, which means we're not doing something, we're not affecting other nuclear weapons, right? Other nations. So we're talking about the US nuclear arsenal. So in spite of even treaties with nuclear sharing, that is just a question of command and control and not a question of ownership. So any nuclear weapons that we have stationed in other countries and bases around the world are still US nuclear weapons. So whether they're stationed in Turkey or Germany or whatever, that command and control question is actually answered quite clearly by that treaty. The fact that we allow for the potential to share doesn't make them their nuclear weapons or not its nuclear weapons. But it also kind of like, I don't know what apps people might dream up about the US, like influencing other countries or using some sort of pressure to get other countries to reduce their nuclear weapons, but that's not what this topic is about. It says its nuclear weapons. So this is a unilateral US action about reducing US nuclear weapons or US nuclear posture. So how would this be done? So this is where we get to the topic kind of having almost two halves. So we have the United States federal government, right, should reduce the number and or role. So the number is kind of a straightforward question, and we'll get there in a minute, but just know that there's two big kind of topic areas, research areas that you can look at. There's a lot of overlap here in terms of their effectiveness and the advantage ground that you're going to find on this. But you can do this by either reducing the just flat out number of nuclear weapons that we have, or by reducing the role of those nuclear weapons. So let's move forward here. The object of the topic. So what are we trying to change in the world, right? So a resolution, a claim of policy deals with a call for change. The object of that change is nuclear weapons. And I think this is interesting because how we define what a nuclear weapon is might be something that is up for an interesting debate. I think you're going to find some pretty clear identifiers, but the fact that our nuclear weapons can be non-nuclear as well. So the delivery systems, right, can be considered part of the nuclear weapon or not. And we had a little bit of this discussion when we were talking about writing this topic. So is the sub that fires the missile the nuclear weapon? Probably not, but there have to be certain elements to certain subs. There have to be certain things, right? So it doesn't say nuclear warheads. It doesn't say, right? So the term nuclear weapons is, I think, up for a little bit of discussion by you all. Now, how fruitful that discussion is, it's kind of up to you. It depends on what the affirmative might be trying to get away with. And how they want to interpret that. The fact that there is some wiggle room in this terminology, nuclear weapons, I don't know that that means that there is a tremendous amount of wiggle room, or, and I certainly don't think it means that the affirmative is going to be able to like run away from the negative all year long. You know, what constitutes a nuclear weapon is fairly easily definable. You can get into some pretty specific scientific definitions that talk about the use of a nuclear reaction and the way in which that releases energy, causing a specific explosion. And in fact, you'll find some stuff that often delineates between a nuclear weapon and even something like a dirty bomb or a radiological weapon. So, like, is anybody familiar with that delineation? Yes, no, I'd like to hear from somebody. This is kind of like my summer school class where you're all just looking at me. So somebody take a shot at it. What's the difference between a nuclear weapon and a dirty bomb or a radiological weapon?
Well, like a dirty bomb is just kind of like unofficial, like untracked homemade nuclear weapon, right?
Not exactly, no. You're close. That's one way that people tend to think about it. Anybody else want to take a shot at it?
Michael posted in the chat direction, design, intention. Do you want to elaborate on that a bit, Michael?
Let's see if I can see the chat. So, Sebastian, I think you're onto it, right? A dirty bomb is actually just a conventional bomb, which means the way in which it explodes is a conventional explosion. It's not caused or created by a nuclear reaction. What makes it dirty, or a dirty bomb, or a radiological weapon is that radioactive material is attached to it. So what the dirty bomb does is through conventional explosion, it spreads radioactive material, but it doesn't have the same sort of force or energy as a nuclear weapon with a nuclear explosion. So yeah, you can turn a nuclear power plant into a weapon, right? If you fire, and if it's not protected right, if it's not hardened correctly, if you manage to get sort of like a conventional bomb into a reactor where there is a core, right? What it does is it spreads radioactive material. But again, that still doesn't have the same impact and wouldn't be defined as a nuclear weapon. And it's also not something that is typically like maintained by nation states. It's more along the lines of non-governmental actors might get their hands on some radioactive material and try to strap it to a big bomb to try to do more after the fact damage. So what constitutes a nuclear weapon and how we change its role or reduce its role? I think that you shouldn't have a lot of difficulty finding sort of useful definitions of the term nuclear weapons. But that is the goal of the topic, is to change by reducing nuclear weapons, either numerically or through their role. And I think both of those affect each other. If you reduce the number of nuclear weapons, that probably has the effect of reducing the role. If you reduce the role, whether you maintain the numbers or not, you might reduce the numbers that we need to maintain by reducing the role. So yeah, number and or role, I think, is a modifier of the object. So how do we reduce the object, the nuclear weapons, is by reducing the number and or the role. So I know I've got subpoints here, right? So the number seems pretty straightforward. I think it's pretty, we have X amount of nuclear weapons, and the affirmative calls for less. Now that may seem like, oh my goodness, there's going to be like mathematically a large number of potential AFs, because you could reduce 1, you could reduce 2, you could reduce 3. I think the term substantially helps with that, although substantially only ever helps us so much. But what's really going to put a check on that is probably the literature base. There's not a lot of authors that you are going to find. There's not a lot of articles that you are going to find that are calling for like, hey, we should get rid of 15 nuclear missiles, or we should get rid of 103 nuclear weapons, right? You're going to find ones that will just generally say we should substantially reduce our number, or they give a specific, like we should reduce it by X percentage to try to get in line with certain international treaties or obligations. Or what you'll also find is probably a lot of literature talking about disarm entirely, right? We should get rid of the entirety of our nuclear weapons, like all of them. And, you know, but from a numeric standpoint, you're going to be kind of going in the same direction. There's not going to be a whole lot of different AFs that just focus on reducing the number. There might be some, but I don't think that that's going to be like, there's not an AF for every number between 1 and the total number of nuclear weapons that we have. The more difficult question here is, what does role mean in this context? And this is, again, something that we also discussed when we were talking about putting our resolutions together, is that if you want to reduce the role of nuclear weapons, it's not the same thing as like we're going to be eliminate, you know, there are 8 roles for nuclear weapons and you have to cut 1 or more of them. You're going to find in your research that there's a limited role already for what we use nuclear weapons for. And reducing that role comes in a few different ways, but not a lot of different ways. So finding what that role is interesting, because that is the purpose of the nuclear posture review, is to define and determine what the role of our nuclear weapons are. So you're going to want to make sure you read the posture review, because they're very particular and careful about the words that they choose there. So the primary role or the sole purpose or whatever, how they state it is what that role is. So when you change it, that is reducing the role. So the purpose of our nuclear weapons, you can reduce their role by making them, you know, by eliminating things like the possibility for offensive use of nuclear weapons. We can only use them defensively. We can use them to deter. You can reduce their ability to deter. So there's a lot of different ways that you can look at, but it's not like it has like, you know, it's not a Shakespeare play. There's not a ton of different roles for our nuclear weapons, and you're trying to choose from this list of roles to eliminate. It's by reducing primarily, it's either offensive or defensive capabilities. And you can do that, and the primary way in which that is done through the nuclear posture review is through that declaratory policy, where we tell the world what our intention is, when we would use them, why we would use them, under what circumstances, that sort of thing. So why would we do this? What are the benefits? Let's think affirmative, right? Let's think on the AF side. What problems does this solve? What are we trying to do here? For what reason? So this sort of gets at the controversy, but for what reason would we want to reduce nuclear weapons? And this isn't a trick question. What do we think?
To try to reduce the chance of a war.
Sure, to reduce the chance that they'll be used in a war, reduce the chance of a war, because nuclear weapons are what? Bad, right? They're destructive. They're highly destructive. They carry with them the possibility to end all life on Earth. You know, if you've been in debate for even a little while, you know that sometimes we get a little bit hyperbolic with our discussions about extinction possibilities, but this is a very real one, right? The exchange of nuclear weapons in a war has a very real possibility of being completely and totally destructive. It's bad, right? So the possibility of reducing their chances of being used in a war, probably going to be the primary point of discussion on this topic. Is it, are they preventing war, or are they making war more likely? I think that a lot of debates are going to come down to that question at the end of the debate, where they are either more or less likely to create destruction. Okay, so that does bring us to the question of the controversy. So what makes this a controversial statement? is because there is disagreement as to whether or not the maintenance of a nuclear arsenal and what our nuclear posture does makes war and like really, really big wars more or less likely. So there are certainly folks who say having these weapons makes war more dangerous, like the possibility that they could be used is tremendously dangerous. And then there are folks that say because we have them and because we maintain them, it makes it, you know, it's a deterrent, right? It makes it less likely that people will escalate their war into like an all-out war. So is it a good idea to reduce nuclear weapons? Why or why not? So that just is going to be that question of if we reduce them, does that encourage others to reduce theirs? Does that does that discourage violence? Does that encourage violence? Does that make right? What impact does that have on you know, global relations and how people fight wars? So possible advantages, it seems like we're just talking about one, but I think that there's probably a number of different subsets. So even if it's just, does this reduce the likelihood of war? I think we can look at a lot of different potential scenarios where that can occur. So one of the things that we were talking about in the topic paper is that this deals with a lot of different areas of conflict geographically around the world. So you could take a look at North Korea, Japan, China, and the South China Seas, and that sort of scenario. You take a look at what's going on with the Iran nuclear deal that was passed and then revoked, and they're trying to resume it, and Iran's intentions or abilities to join the nuclear club, and what impact that has in that region of the world, where we look at sort of conflict and issues in that area. We also can look at where this kind of all started, which is sort of in Europe and the United States and Russia, and what's going on with Russia and Ukraine right now, and Russia and NATO right now. So the potential for discussion there, for debate there, has a lot of different geographic difference that you could take a look at. But then there's also the differences in things that you may have heard mentioned in past, where I think we're going to explore them a little bit more deeply on this year's topic, sort of the differences between escalation, miscalculation, accidental launch, those sorts of things that are all possibilities as advantages. So those are sort of, I would say, starting points that you can potentially take a look at when you are building your affirmative. So what are some possible disadvantages? And this is, again, I want to spur some discussion. We've got about 15 minutes left on this, or maybe a little bit longer if we want to go a little bit longer. What are some possible disadvantages? How many people have been already researching, looking, thinking about disads?
So, if people remove nuclear weapons, a lot of countries move towards biological weapons, which do a lot more damage to civilians and have a lot of lasting effects.
So yeah, that would be so the possibility that we reduce our nuclear weapons, but simply replace them with something worse, like biological weapons, would be a possible disadvantage there.
I think it could be like an advantage or a disadvantage depending on how you debate US hedge. But like I think nuclear weapons are kind of a cornerstone of US hegemony, so reducing them would definitely have some sort of direct impact on that, which could either be good or bad, depending on how you view hegemony.
Right. So, and certainly depending on how you understand and what you research about things like hegemony. So you can take a look at sort of generically, largely the term hegemony, and there's a lot of different political theory dealing with different types of hegemony. Nuclear hegemony is often referred to as like nuclear supremacy in some literature bases, and then in others you're going to just find it as the nuclear deterrent, right? So that hegemony functions as a deterrent. So the question, so that would be coming down on that side of the line, that maintaining the nuclear arsenal maintains peace through deterrence rather than increases the risk of war. So that would be kind of like the crux of the question there. So a hedge disad, right, is probably something we're going to see, or a supremacy disad, or a deterrence. I've been referring to it as the deterrence disadvantage. I think that that is probably going to be a very common disadvantage that you see, which is, hey, look, if you reduce the U.S. nuclear arsenal substantially, right, either number or through role, that reduces the deterrence substantially, which leads to any number of different possible scenarios of problems. What are some other possible disadvantages? Somebody in the chat said something about the nuclear umbrella. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so pretty much like you reduce the role of US nuclear weapons, that also reduces the role of nuclear weapons overseas. And that goes for a bunch of countries,
Right. So
such
what
as like
that
Japan and South.
Yeah, what that addresses, so we're talking about probably the two primary disadvantages on the topic. So one that we just discussed is the deterrence disadvantage. This one is referred to typically as the assurance disad. So the nuclear umbrella is assurances that we have offered to allies. So countries that we are allied through a variety of treaties. One of them is NATO, right? So we have offered assurances to our NATO allies that we would protect them in the instance of war with our nuclear weapons, potentially, right? But other allies as well, non-NATO alliances where we have extended assurances. So an example that comes to mind is Saudi Arabia, not our best ally in the world for a number of reasons, but we have extended the nuclear umbrella to them. And one of the things that that does is keeps Saudi Arabia from seeking its own nuclear weapons, which could also be a big potential problem. So if we start telling our allies, hey, we no longer offer this nuclear assurance to you, their responses can vary, but a lot of them would proliferate. So we're all familiar with the term proliferation, I hope. But if not, it's just the expansion of who has the nuclear weapons, right? So if a country proliferates, that means a country that currently doesn't have nuclear weapons would get nuclear weapons. It's no longer all that mysterious or all that difficult for countries who really want to get nuclear weapons to just develop them. The science is at this point pretty well known. It's still difficult. It's still hard to do. Countries that don't have large budgets dedicated to it are going to struggle. There's a lot of international pressure against it. It's still one of our more successful sort of international arms control measures is the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But again, the US sort of revoking its assurances unilaterally, surprisingly, would potentially lead to proliferation by some of our allies. So those are two big possible disadvantages that I think will, you know, as a starting point for your research while you are at this camp and as you're getting ready for the start of the season, are going to prepare you well for the debate. Anybody have any others?
Someone could read Spark.
I mean, so yeah, we could talk to me a little bit more about that. As a disadvantage, I'm uncertain about that, but I go ahead.
Oh wait, no, I guess that doesn't make sense. Yeah, no, you're right.
But so for those of you who are unfamiliar, I did want to address this at some point. Well, I'll come back to it. Let's see what else I've got on this slide. So the scope of the controversy here, the topic seems big, but is it? One of the things that we discussed is I think the topic is deep, but not broad. There's a lot to learn, and I think you're going to learn a lot. There's a lot to research. There's a lot of really current research, so you're not going to have to be digging too deep, and you're not going to have to actually get all that creative. I was having this conversation with a couple of people, you know, a couple of my assistant coaches and stuff, that we don't have to get like super creative. The center of the topic is very debatable. You don't have to really run away from the question of the topic. You don't have to like bend over backwards to try to come up with stuff that's all that surprising. It's both a very defensible affirmative and a very defensible negative, and you're just going to debate it out, and the more skilled debater should win. It's enough to sustain the year because I don't think anything about our nuclear policy is changing in the next year. The Nuclear Posture Review was released in 2022. It's not particularly old. They don't do these all the time. There's no reason why in an election year the Biden administration is going to release an altered nuclear posture. So I think that the topic is big enough to sustain without being too large, where the negative is going to be having to chase around the affirmative all year long. And there's also not really a shortage of negative ground, which for folks who debated last year, where we struggled a little bit finding like disads, there's going to be lots and lots of disads. There's going to be counterplan ground. There's lots of critique ground that we didn't tap into. But there's a really good article included in the topic paper for those of you who are really interested in the critique. There's that article, I think, is a good starting point. Lots and lots of interesting stuff there. So I think we can limit the scope of the topic to the statement, and I think that the literature base will provide pretty good limits on your research without the wording having to do a whole lot of work. Okay, I'm not sure, Michael, what your comment in the chat is meant to say. I wasn't trying to make any like overarching statements about peace. That's certainly something debatable and questionable there in terms of what that looks like.
I think he's saying that could be used as an advantage.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, we could take a look at that. So the number question seems like a large amount of possible cases, but it's really not. If you're looking for something giving you like, we should eliminate 150 instead of 160, that is not a big debate in the literature on this topic. You will find stuff about specific systems, like, hey, we should eliminate this particular sea-based missile, or we should eliminate these particular types of ICBMs or something like that. You might find some good research on, but there's not going to be a lot of like hidden little tiny AFs there that are hard to track down, that are hard to research, and also that won't, like, even if you're finding that stuff, it's not like it won't link to sort of the bigger disadvantages out there. And similarly with roles, I think one of the main affirmatives that we're going to see a lot of, at least at the beginning of the year, is there's kind of two questions in declaratory policy. There were two different declarations that a lot of folks were pushing for that didn't get put into the posture review. One is a declaration of no first use. So the United States does not have a policy of no first use, which means we technically reserve the right to like just nuke somebody if we want to. Most people don't believe that we would, but it is a possibility. And it's not even that it would necessarily be an unprovoked sort of out of the blue, hey, we're just firing missiles at whomever. It's more a question of, would we be the first ones to use nuclear weapons in an escalated sort of all-out war type of situation? And while we probably wouldn't, we don't have a policy that says that we would. Whereas other countries do have that policy that says we won't use nuclear weapons first. So a declaration of no first use is a policy that a lot of folks have pushed for. And then a somewhat similar declaration that would serve a similar, although not exactly the same purpose, so it's a different body of literature, would be one called sole purpose. It says we would declare the sole purpose of our nuclear weapons is deterrence. And that would be a functional no first use without saying no first use. So I think you're going to find a lot of research on those two ways in which you can sort of reduce the role of nuclear weapons. But again, what you're going to find as you research is there's not a list, there's not a menu of nuclear weapons roles that you're like, oh, we're going to reduce this role. Oh, we're going to reduce this role. It's by making declaratory policy, by changing sort of the circumstances under which we would use our nuclear weapons and limiting those circumstances compared to the status quo, you reduce the role. I'm looking forward to what you all find in the research on that. There are some different areas that I think are going to be interesting, but again, nothing so out there or difficult to research that the negative is going to have to spend a lot of time chasing stuff down, and nothing that probably won't really link to a lot of negative strategies. So what does this leave out? The first one I put is probably arms control treaties. While the nuclear posture review does talk about arms control, in terms of the practicality for a debate topic, because that requires the agreement of other sovereign nations, it's really difficult to debate about. Because you would have to be like, oh, the US and Russia will agree to this, or the US and China will agree to this, or the US and whomever will agree to this policy. There aren't any outstanding arms controls treaties waiting for the, particularly with nuclear weapons, waiting for the United States to sort of sign or accede to. There's not a nuclear treaty that's enforced that we're not a part of right now. And in fact, one of the ones that we are in and maintaining and sticking to, Russia has already said that they are not going to renew, or they're not. It's on tenuous. So there's some interesting research about the New START treaty that was not negotiated all that long ago. It expires in 2026, and there's not a lot of hope that it will be renewed. For now, Russia seems to be sticking to it, but they have said that they aren't really going to be bound by it. But there's not a lot we can do about that treaty in terms of like a debate topic. So while arms control is going to be an issue that you read about and you see about, it's really not a lot of ground on either sort of the affirmative or the negative side of this topic. And then the other one that was sort of discussed is this issue of like nuclear materials. We're firmly on, this topic is firmly on the side of dealing with nuclear weapons and not just generally like radioactive material, not nuclear energy. We're not looking at nuclear power plants. We're not looking at that sort of question. We're not even looking at, and again, there was a whole section in the posture review dealing with the concern that the US has with its access to nuclear materials in order to maintain its arsenal. But the reduction of nuclear weapons, as far as the AF goes, doesn't really deal with that nuclear material question. The US doesn't really mine much of its own nuclear material. And it maintains a very limited number of what are called pits, plutonium pits, that get used for making nuclear weapons. So I don't think that the nuclear material question is central, or, you know, at best, there's some tangential information here in terms of the topic. But is there anything else that you all were thinking of that maybe might be part of the topic, that is or is not part of the topic? What have we left out in terms of the scope of the controversy? What do you all think?
I know it was kind of talked about earlier, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on like delivery systems and like whether or not they should be included in the first part of the topic.
So I think that will be an interesting question in terms of like how we define a nuclear weapon. But I think delivery systems are definitely part of the topic. I don't think that, you know, eliminating delivery systems or certain types of, I think that the AF will have to defend that those are specifically nuclear weapons. So I think like parking 8 subs or whatever is probably not going to get it done in terms of the AF. I think though, taking a look at certain things that are like almost exclusively used as nuclear weapons delivery systems, making them nuclear weapons, that sort of thing, I think is part of it. Looking at like reducing the triad, so saying, hey, we're just gonna get rid of all of the air-based, right? So we're gonna take away one leg of the triad. We're gonna stick with just ICBMs and subs as an AF. I think that that could be sort of interesting in terms of reducing the role or number. So I think delivery systems is part of the topic. I think that there will potentially be a topicality question as to whether or not that is nuclear weapons, but I think that it won't be that hard to write apps about delivery systems. Anything else you think that maybe you're curious about, whether I think it's in the scope of the controversy or not? Because again, remember, this is your topic now, not mine.
Well, like, so the term substantially, obviously there's not gonna be much lit on like we should remove 5 nukes or something. Are there really many forms of nuclear reform or limitations that aren't substantial or wouldn't be considered substantial?
I would think so. I think that there's definitely some stuff when you start digging in, you're going to come across some stuff about like nuclear modernization, where they are phasing out nuclear weapons that we sort of just no longer need because they've already been replaced by more effective, more efficient, more controlled type weapons. So, you know, you might find an article somewhere that says, hey, you know what? These nuclear silos in Wyoming are just not needed anymore. We should get rid of them. And one could argue that that would not be a substantial reduction in our nuclear weapons. So I think substantial will be a meaningful debate on this topic. I think it's at least a reasonable limit on the act to keep them from saying, okay, we're going to take this one nuclear silo in Montana and we're going to turn it into an Airbnb. And like, we don't link to any of your disads and you're not ready for us. And we've got this small advantage from it. Like, I think that a T substantial is going to get them there. Any other thoughts on the scope? So I'll throw one out there as well that was brought up. I said I would come back to this because is this idea of spark. So this keeps coming up for some reason, right? So if you're not familiar with the spark argument, so it's been around for a long time, believe it or not. I debated it back in the mid-90s. The spark argument suggests that we should launch a limited nuclear war in the here and now in order to prevent a much more destructive future nuclear war. The idea is we could, and there's a number of different ways I've heard it discussed. I can't seem to find any really good cards on it right now. Maybe you've got them somewhere. But it says something like, right now, our nuclear capacity isn't like world ending and we need to reset sort of the nuclear taboo, or we need to be able to sort of decapitate another nation's nuclear weapons capability before they get the ability to deter us or something like that. So there's some arguments that say like, hey, launch now. I don't take those arguments very seriously. I don't think there's a lot of actual serious people who are suggesting that argument. I think we are long past the place where even a limited exchange of nuclear weapons would not be like abhorrently destructive. Does the topic necessarily exclude that idea? I don't know. I think some clever people will come up with the idea that, oh, you can reduce your nuclear weapons by launching them. Personally, as the author of the paper, and if somebody wanted to like cut this card from a transcript, that was not the intent of the paper. The paper did not intend to include Spark as a topical app. That doesn't mean that you can't come up with something and debate it, right? So certainly judges will listen to it. Maybe even some judges that are here in this room right now will listen to it. I don't think most of your judges are just going to like completely shut it out. I think it links to pretty much every neg argument that's out there, and I just haven't seen any serious authors suggesting that this would be a good positive policy. But if there were questions about it, we could, I guess, spend a minute or so on it. It's 5:05 though. Noel said I had an hour. Yes, Noel is one who would listen to that app, at least as topical, but I would certainly feel like the linked stories on the neg are not going to be that hard. Let's see. So where you should begin your research if you haven't already begun, start it now. If you haven't already started, start researching now. That's why you're at camp. So start reading. There's lots and lots and lots of stuff to read. Ask your big questions about the topic, like what is the status quo? Where are we at right now? Don't assume that you know stuff. There's some things that you think you know about our nuclear policy that is probably outdated or just wrong. So don't make assumptions. Inform yourself about the topic. Use that starting research to get a lay of the land and figure stuff out. What is the status quo? What are some problems that can be solved? Where are we at? What are some problems that may be caused? And that's the end of my slideshow. So I don't know how much more time we have for any questions, but I am certainly open to answering any and all of your questions now that the slideshow is over. That was my planned lecture, and only going 5 minutes over, I don't feel so bad.
Yeah, pretty good, all things considered.
Anything I missed? Anything you're not feeling or that you're feeling uncertain of?
Well, I missed some of the discussion earlier about what branch would be responsible, but I know we kind of concluded to be the executive branch. But I think it was last year Elizabeth Warren proposed an NFU bill in Congress. Could Congress not theoretically do something like that as well?
Congress could theoretically pass a bill like that. That is constitutionally questionable, though, because though every time Congress has tried to pass some sort of War Powers Act or some sort of check on the commander-in-chief's ability to, wage war, right? They get to declare it, but he gets to, wage it. The courts have ruled with the executive. So yeah, Warren proposed an NFU. There's one, I think, working its way through the House, but it hasn't gotten anywhere. So you could suggest it, but I think that where you're going to run into trouble there is like its solvency, its ability to like actually get it done. If the president just says no, we're not going to reduce those weapons. What can Congress do other than impeach the president? So I suspect the courts would support the executive in that question. But a bigger question is that the literature supporting congressional action is very, very limited. And I don't know that it's particularly advantageous compared to having the executive do it. So if that's an area you're interested in exploring, by all means do so. I just don't know to what end. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I did actually. I just generally want to know like what, like outlook on that would be.
I mean, so you could take a look at, so we have like the War Powers Act from the 70s that says stuff like, oh, the president has to do this or has to do that and has to check in and can only do things for like this amount of days. And that has had limited utility in actually constraining presidential actions. What other questions do we have about the topic or anything that I have asserted about the topic? Everybody feeling ready to do some research? All right, I've never met such a quiet group of debaters. Usually we would have some chit chat going on.
I'm excited.
You're always excited, Noel. Did any of the coaches want to ask me some leading questions that might be helpful for their students? No?
I guess I had thoughts about the reducing the role of nuclear weapons and the effects T arguments that are inevitably going to result. I know that's like, I'm sure we'll cover this at some point, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on creating a reduce the role AF and fighting back effects T?
So I guess I'm not sure what the effects T argument would be.
I guess like because there's so much ambiguity on what reducing the role like means. So it makes me think of the renewable energies topic where like is increasing investment, does that mean increased like output, right? Like do we if we reduce the role, do we have to see like I don't know. Maybe I'm not making sense. Like reducing role just seems really ambiguous, and I feel like debaters could make an argument that like because of how many like steps would be necessary to actually reduce our like use of nuclear weapons or willingness to use them, that it's like too many steps. I don't know.
I mean, Shauna, I would be more than happy to spend another hour giving an effects T lecture. That would be fun for me, but I don't know that we necessarily have a ton of time for that. But I would suggest that the answer to that question has to do with what the plan text mandates. So when the mandate is to a mandate of no first use or a mandate of sole purpose, it's not so the role of nuclear weapons is something that we state by policy. It's not something that can really be changed by effect, right? So if the role of nuclear weapons is to deter, you can mandate a reduction in that deterrence. If you don't mandate a reduction in that deterrence, even if you take away a number of nuclear weapons or you do something else, I would suggest that the DoD would automatically correct to make sure that the deterrence level stays the same. So it's a question of mandate versus effect. So just how your plan is worded, I think is going to answer that question. But I think the answer to that question, at least in my opinion over the years, is that we ought to be teaching our students about effects topicality a little bit better.
So, sorry, go ahead, Shauna.
Just like saying fair enough.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, and I could be wrong. I feel like that was kind of it. Maybe is the question about effects T is that like an AF that totally removes our deterrence, is that a topical AF if it is like we should always first strike, right? If we don't use them, we're not using nukes defensively anymore. We're only using them offensively. Is that a reduction in the role? Because it's a reduction in the current role, but not the role overall. Does that make sense?
I mean, I can see what you're saying there.
It's annoying that people will think like that, but they will, right?
Sure. Yeah, and I think that was one of the things we sort of struggled with when we were writing the resolutions, is what term exactly to use. I would argue that doesn't reduce the role, that just changes the role. So you have to sort of like maintain the same, like the role has to be the same, it just needs to be reduced. Right? So like adding a new role in place of the old role would not necessarily be an effects T question, it would be an extra T question. So like if your defense is, I reduced the role of our nuclear weapons by eliminating the deterrence role, then you have increased the role by adding in this offensive, right? Creating a new role that didn't exist before, I would argue would be extra topical, right? Which is why I think that reduced by launching is extra topical. But again, it's just going to be a debate, right? So like I said, I would love to spend an hour talking about effects and extra T, but I don't think that this is the appropriate time slot for that.
Don't worry, we've got another hour scheduled just to talk about effects and extra T.
Fun.
That's at least a small part of it. But yeah, does anyone have any more questions? comments, concerns? Okay. Thank you so much, Jared.
All right, I'm gonna stop the recording, at least on my end.